What's very important to understand that in 1994, the Clinton administration decided that it was going to expand NATO eastward, and that the United States and its allies would have an open door policy. That meant that they would allow any country that wanted to come into NATO to join NATO. And the first group of countries that entered NATO from Eastern Europe were Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, and they all entered in 1999. Then in 2004, another group of countries entered NATO, and this included the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Slovakia. And then, very importantly, in 2008, NATO said that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. And the Russians then said that this was unacceptable, that Ukraine joining NATO was an existential threat. But the problem from the West's point of view was that they had an open door policy regarding NATO expansion. And the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, felt that if Ukraine wanted to become part of NATO, it could become part of NATO, no matter what the Russians said. But of course, the Russians said, this is not going to happen. So a crisis broke out in February 2014. That's the beginning of the crisis between the West and Ukraine on one side and Russia on the other side. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, what did the United States do when that crisis broke out in February 2014? Did it back off and say we have to respect Russia's interests? No, it did not do that. The United States thought that it could shove NATO expansion into Ukraine down Russia's throat. And of course, what happened in February 2022, this is 8 years after the crisis broke out, you got a major war, that war that is now taking place. The question you want to ask yourself is, what did the United States do once the war broke out? Again, it doubled down. It increased its commitment to bringing Ukraine into NATO. So what's going on here is that the United States is deeply committed, as is NATO more generally, to bringing Ukraine into NATO. And it is willing to do everything it can to help Ukraine defeat Russia on the battlefield. And this explains, I believe, why the United States has gotten more deeply involved since 2014, when the crisis broke out, and shows no signs of walking away from the war in Ukraine. Again, you do not want to lose sight of how deeply committed the United States and its European allies are to an open door policy regarding NATO expansion. They really believe that any country that wants to become part of NATO has a right to do so, and it doesn't matter what the Russians think. And they remain firmly committed to that belief. And they have little interest, the West has little interest in seeing a neutral Ukraine. If you want to ask how to solve this crisis, it's actually quite simple. Well, one is to make sure that Ukraine does not become part of NATO, and two, that it is a neutral state. And that would go a long way towards solving this crisis. But the United States at this point in time has no interest in a neutral Ukraine. It wants to see Ukraine in NATO. Well, I think the Ukrainian invasion into the Kursk area of Russia was a major mistake. And it was a major mistake because it's not going to improve Ukraine's position in the war, its position on the battlefield. I believe that the Ukrainians thought that if they invaded the Kursk region, that they would cause the Russian military all sorts of problems. And this would shift the momentum in the war away from Russia and toward Ukraine. This was a foolish idea because, if anything, what invading the Kursk region did was to accelerate Ukrainian losses in eastern Ukraine, which is the main battlefield in this war. So the Ukrainians who were doing poorly in eastern Ukraine before the Kursk offensive, their Kursk offensive, are now doing worse. And the reason is that the Ukrainians had to take forces away from the battlefields in eastern Ukraine, these critically important battlefields, and deploy them as part of the Kursk offensive. In fact, because the Ukrainians are on the offensive in the Kursk region, that means they're out in the open and they're moving forward. And that allows Russian aircraft and Russian drones to destroy those Ukrainian forces more easily than if they were on the defensive. So this was a major mistake on the part of Ukraine. But I would say it's highly unlikely. If NATO were to send ground forces and air forces into Ukraine, and those forces were fighting against the Russians, you would then have a great power war. In Europe, you would have the United States, which is, of course, a great power, fighting against Russia, which is a great power. And this would be a war between two great powers that are armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. And furthermore, that war would be taking place on Russia's doorstep. And Russia already views the war in Ukraine as an existential threat. If the Americans and their European allies were involved, this would be an existential threat on steroids. It would be deeply worrying to the Russians, and it would be a scenario where they might very well use nuclear weapons to protect themselves. The United States, of course, recognizes this. The United States does not want a great power war with Russia, and it certainly does not want a war with Russia that has the potential to escalate to the nuclear level. So I think it is extremely unlikely that we, meaning the Americans, would get involved in the fighting in Ukraine if Ukraine continues to lose, which I think is going to happen. This is not to deny that the Americans will be tempted to intervene and that the Europeans, especially the East Europeans, will be tempted to intervene. But I think cooler heads will prevail, and NATO will not intervene in the fighting in Ukraine. I think at this point in time, it's almost impossible to see how the United States can back off in a meaningful way from the war in Ukraine. I think the United States may reduce its commitment to Ukraine somewhat. I think that's especially true if Donald Trump gets elected in November. But I believe that the United States will remain committed to Ukraine for the foreseeable future. If Harris wins the election, she will basically continue Biden's policy, which is to do everything possible to support the Ukrainians. There'll be little change in her policy. And as you know, Donald Trump makes the argument that if he is elected president in November, that he will end the war in Ukraine very quickly. And he basically says that he will end that war even before he moves into the White House. I certainly don't believe that's going to happen, and I don't believe he will do anything of any consequence to end the war once he does enter the White House. I think that this war will end when Ukraine is defeated on the battlefield and understands that it makes no sense to continue fighting. I don't believe you're going to get a meaningful peace agreement, but I do think you'll get a frozen conflict at some point, simply because the Ukrainians will no longer be capable of carrying on the battle. They're just suffering so greatly now, and they're losing territory, and they're losing huge numbers of soldiers at a rapid pace. They just can't continue, in my opinion, much beyond 2025. So I think this war will end either late this year or early next year and turn into a frozen conflict. Well, Ukraine will be a dysfunctional rump state. It will have lost a large chunk of territory. How much territory it will ultimately lose is hard to say at this point in time, but there's no question Ukraine's going to lose a lot of its territory, and that the Russians are going to have a deep-seated interest in making sure that Ukraine is economically weak and politically dysfunctional. So this is a disaster for Ukraine. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, what will Ukraine do after you get this frozen conflict? What will the West do after you get this frozen conflict? And my view is that both Ukraine and the West will go to great lengths to undermine Russia, and especially to undermine its position inside those areas of Ukraine that Russia has annexed. So this conflict, the conflict is not going to end. The war, I think, will end, and it will turn into a frozen conflict. But in the context of that frozen conflict, the Russians will go to great lengths to keep Ukraine as a dysfunctional rump state. The Russians will go to great lengths to sow dissension inside of Europe, and that includes both NATO and the European Union. The Russians will go to great lengths to sow dissension between the United States and its European allies. And at the same time, the West and the Ukrainians will go to great lengths to cause trouble for Russia. So once we get a frozen conflict, that does not mean you're going to have something approximating peace as a result of all that's happened. In fact, what you're going to get is trouble for as far as the eye can see. One does not want to underestimate the consequences, the serious consequences, the disastrous consequences of the 2008 NATO decision to bring Ukraine into the alliance. That was a huge mistake. It has had catastrophic consequences so far, and it will have more catastrophic consequences moving forward. But from an American point of view, Ukraine has been a disaster for a variety of reasons. But one of the main reasons is that it has pushed the Russians closer to China. And the Russians and the Chinese now have a vested interest in cooperating to thwart the United States all around the globe. Both China and Russia see the United States as an adversary, and they both understand that it's in their mutual interest to work together to check the United States, to cause trouble for the United States. In an ideal world, the United States would have close relations with Russia. It would be allied with Russia against China. And the United States, in an ideal world, would do everything it could to exploit differences between China and Russia and get Russia to be close to the United States and basically an adversary of China. But the exact opposite has happened in large part because of the Ukraine war. So you now have this close relationship between Russia and China. All of this is to say that from China's point of view, the war in Russia is manna from heaven. It's really good news. The Chinese have a vested interest in seeing the war or the conflict between the West on one side and Russia on the other side continue for the foreseeable future, because it will ensure that Russia and China have good relations. And that's obviously in China's national interest, but it's not in America's national interest. There are a number of people in the West who argue that Russia is becoming a vassal state of China, that the Chinese are basically moving into a world where they can dictate Russian policy in all sorts of ways. I think this argument is wrong. I think the Russians will do what's in their national interest. And the Russians are a great power. And as a great power, Russia has lots of flexibility in terms of which policies it pursues or doesn't pursue. But I think there's no question that the Russians are going to seek help, seek assistance from China, and I think China's going to give Russia lots of assistance. China has a vested interest in seeing Russia defeat the West and Ukraine in this conflict. It's in China's interest. So China will help Russia. And in terms of what happens in East Asia, Russia will go to great lengths to help China prevail against the United States in any conflict situation that arises, because it's in Russia's interest to do everything possible to defeat the United States all over the globe, not only in Ukraine. So these two countries are going to have close relations as long as the United States is an adversary of both countries.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化，强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，活肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。